What is on your radar, Ryan?
Well, I couldn't really find a way to shoehorn Rogan into this one. So all I can say is that Joe Rogan has been completely silent about the scuttlebutt on the Securities and Exchange Commission. Specifically to dig into this, Gary Gensler, who's the chairman, has been battling the other two Democrats on the SEC over the contours of the climate change rule the agency is working on. It's a critical issue because Democrats ran on doing something about the climate crisis, and so far, the prospects for all the climate policy built into the Build Back Better Act aren't looking all that good. The private sector, though, can play a profoundly powerful role and could actually do so extremely quickly if the right people started to think it was the right move. The market has been tentatively moving away from fossil fuels, and every Fortune 500 CEO knows the industry is on the way out, but the question is whether we transition quickly or in like 100 years. Right now, everybody is sort of sitting around watching each other to see if anybody moves and ready to move if somebody else does. That's where the SEC can come in. Biden ran on a pledge to require publicly traded companies to disclose to investors what their exposure is to climate change and what their carbon output is throughout their supply chain and through the end use of their products. Now, the first part's important because investors need to know, for instance, if all of your properties are in a place that will be underwater in the next decade or two. The second part matters because it goes to what's called regulatory risk. The more exposure to fossil fuels a company has, the more vulnerable it is to future regulation of carbon. So it's something investors need to know about. And finally, investors are increasingly looking at a company's ESG, or its environmental, social, and corporate governance. Some major institutional investors like BlackRock have made ESG core to their investment strategies. There's now market demand, and the SEC's role has always been to make sure investors' demands are being met in a way that can be trusted and verified. That's what separates American capital markets from those in China or Saudi Arabia. Our system is built to rip off and exploit the working class, but investors have to be treated fairly. Back in April, the SEC under Gensler said it would move promptly on an ESG rule. It was expected after the summer. Then Gensler said it would come by the end of 2021, and now we have Gensler bogged down. It's a strange turn for what had been quite the redemption arc for Gensler. He spent most of his career rising through the ranks of Goldman Sachs before going to work for the Clinton administration's Treasury Department, where he helped deregulate derivatives, a key driver of the financial crisis. He later did an about-face, saying that deregulation had been all wrong. Obama named him to be chair of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, and he became one of the administration's most aggressive foes of Wall Street, doing battle even with the Obama administration. By the time Biden named him SEC chair, he'd earned the moniker Wall Street critic. But his reign at the SEC has been marred by indecision and poor personnel decisions, and he risks reverting back to the role he played in the 90s, of a guy unable to see where the world was heading and afraid to do the right thing. In this case, Gensler is arguing internally that a tough climate rule will be easier for a company to take down in court. But the court challenge is coming anyway, and it's not obvious the courts will be any kinder either way. You could argue that a tough rule that's already in place might even be harder for the Republicans on the Supreme Court to strike down. Who knows? The smartest take so far has come from Robert Jackson Jr., a former Democratic SEC commissioner who told Bloomberg, quote, "Their policy choices should be driven by their conviction about how best to protect investors, not lobbyists' self-interested speculation about what randomly chosen federal judges might say when industry inevitably sues." So where has Joe Rogan been on the question of Gary Gensler?
Rogan. We're trying. Now this is interesting.
If you say it 3 times, it magically summons the algorithm.
Oh, yeah. We're trying here, my friend. I don't know that I agree. I don't think it's crazy to take into account the likelihood of a regulation being struck down by the court in your calculus for whether it's good regulation. I mean, if you even
you can't be crazy.
Speaking of radical libertarian policies, right? No. Put in a regulation so ridiculous, so wholly unfriendly to capitalism, like ban money, and then the court strikes it down.
Can just be like,
yeah.
No, it is. There is. Right. It's one of those questions that is legitimate at its center. Like you can't pass a rule that is on its face absurdly unconstitutional. Like that's true. On the other hand, you have to do something. Like, so both sides like have
or that just
a
punishes
decent
companies
argument.
just for being like, I don't want to punish people just for making money, just for being successful, productive. We want, if you believe in the there should be some regulation, right? It's to improve competition. It's to keep things a little bit fair. Prevent horrific abuse, that sort of thing.
And all we're talking about here is transparency.
Yeah.
All now the companies are saying it's not fair to make us figure out our supply chain carbon output, and there's some rationale behind that. I get that. So you can think of a way to narrow it to say, okay, you don't have to. You don't have to know the carbon output of every single worker driving to every single factory of every single supplier. Like, yes, obviously you have to narrow it down to some point, but you also need to you can't just say, well, all we own is this mailbox in Ireland, and the carbon output of that is basically zero. So our carbon output is zero. It's like, no, wait a minute, you're one of the biggest companies in the world. You're not fooling us with that. So there has to be some...
They just like guess a number, and how are we going to know if it's inaccurate?
Well, that's the other debate where I'm actually on Gensler's side. The two Democrats are saying that these need to be audited in the same way that a lot of the other ones are. And his argument is that writing the audit rules for this would take like a year and a half. And so at that point, yes, like that's too long. Like, you need to do this now. Like because too often these administrations start passing all of these rules like at the very end of their tenure. They took, Obama took like 7 years to implement these kind of new minimum wage salary requirements. Like 7 years? Come on, man. And then immediately the Republicans come in and Trump, because it's within a certain time toward the end, Trump could just get rid of this pro-worker guy screwing over a bunch of Dollar General that they call a manager. They hire two people and call them both managers at Dollar General, pay them $20,000 a year, and then work them 80 hours a week. And be like, no, we're not violating any minimum wage laws. You're a salaried employee here. And so there was a rule to crack down on that, and they took 7 years to write it, and it got tossed. So yes, so I'm partly with Gensler here, but the key is urgency. Like, the things, you just need to get it out there and get this fight going, because a lot of these companies, they're actually ready to move. They just need a little push.
A little push. So maybe a small regulation, just a nudge.
Just a nudge. Because
a
lot of these
carbon
CEOs
output, and then they'll do it. Half of them kind of want to do this for good PR reasons, right? They want to go, look at us, we're a green company.
And they see the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
Like, they see where it's heading.
Actually, investigating, auditing companies to find out their true carbon footprint number sounds like it would be a massively fraught undertaking. Would not want that job.
No.
Or I wouldn't want to be the company trying to turn over my how many steps did I take while I was driving the documents to your office? Now they're out of date. I have to add them.
We can be somewhat reasonable here.
I don't trust the government to be somewhat reasonable in any circumstance.
Understandable.
No. All right.
Well, we'll have our rising panel up next. Stick around for that.
Could be talking about Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
Never know. Find out.
Stick around. Only one way to find out.